Lev Vygotsky was born in 1896 in Orsha, which was then part of the Russian Empire and is now known as Belarus. He came from a Russian Jewish family during a time when Jews in the Russian Empire faced significant prejudice and restrictions. Despite these challenges, he pursued an impressive academic path, initially studying law before shifting to literature, philosophy, and eventually psychology. Vygotsky worked at the Moscow Institute of Psychology and is best remembered for his groundbreaking socio-cultural theory. He believed that learning is a social process and that culture and language are critical tools for cognitive development. His most famous contribution is the zone of proximal development, which explains how children learn best with guidance that bridges what they already know or what they can master with support. Though he died at just 37 years old from tuberculosis in 1934, Vygotsky's work continues to shape how we understand learning, development, and the role of social interaction in education. Let's explore some of the core ideas behind Lev Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, a framework that continues to shape how we understand learning and development today. Vygotsky believed that learning doesn't happen in isolation. It begins through interaction with others. From the earliest stages of development, it's through engaging with caregivers, teachers, and peers that children start to build knowledge. He believed that social interaction is the foundation of cognitive growth. Vygotsky emphasized that our cultural background influences not just what we know, but how we think, what we value, and how we solve problems. Every culture passes down knowledge, traditions, and norms that become embedded in the ways we learn and understand the world. Also, according to Vygotsky, language is more than just a way to communicate. It's a primary tool we use to think. Through speaking and listening, children internalize concepts and begin to develop complex thinking skills. Language is the bridge between social interaction and individual understanding. Children don't simply absorb information passively. They actively build understanding through shared experiences, discussions, questions, hands-on tasks, and cooperative learning. Learning in this view is always social first, then internalized. That's where guidance from adults and peers becomes important. Vygotsky introduced the idea of the more knowledgeable other, someone who supports a learner by offering guidance, asking questions, or modeling tasks. This could be a parent, teacher, sibling, or even a peer. This is central to his theory of the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. The ZPD is a space between what a learner can do on their own and what they can do with help. It's the sweet spot for learning, the area where support is needed but growth is possible. To move through the ZPD, learners need scaffolding. Scaffolding is the support a teacher or guide provides to help a learner master a task. As a student grows in skills and confidence, that support is gradually withdrawn until they can do it independently. Let's take a look at Vygotsky's view on language and its role in cognitive development, a cornerstone of his socio-cultural theory. Vygotsky believed that language drives cognitive growth. To him, language wasn't just a means of communication, it was the very foundation of thought. As children acquire language, they also develop the ability to understand, process, and organize information. In other words, thinking becomes possible because of language. Children first use language to interact with the people around them, parents, siblings, and caregivers. These early conversations help children make sense of their world. They learn vocabulary, social rules, and ideas through simple exchanges. This is where cognitive development begins, through social connection. As children grow, their speech becomes more egocentric, or what Vygotsky called private speech. At this stage, language and thought begin to merge. You've probably seen a child talking to themselves while working through a problem. This isn't random. Vygotsky recognized it as a key developmental step. Private speech helps children focus, plan, and problem solve. It's their way of thinking out loud while navigating a task. By the time they're older, children begin to use silent internal dialogue to guide their thinking. Even as adults, we often talk ourselves through decisions silently. That's inner speech in action. It's proof that language remains essential to cognition throughout life. Vygotsky believed that language helps children classify, remember, focus, and reason. In a very real sense, language gives structure to the mind. Without it, academic skills like reading, comprehension, problem solving, and analysis would be far more difficult to develop. For Vygotsky, learning is mediated by language. Whether through conversations, instruction, or questioning, knowledge is passed from one person to another through words. As students engage in dialogue, whether with a teacher or peer, they internalize concepts and make them their own. This belief in the cultural and cognitive power of language wasn't just theoretical for Vygotsky. It was also political and practical. He was actively involved in Soviet efforts to expand education and literacy among non-Russian populations, especially in Central Asia, where Turkic peoples, such as the Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Tatars lived. These initiatives were part of a broader policy called Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, which aimed to educate and empower ethnic minorities across the Soviet Union. Vygotsky's research into bilingualism and language development often drew from these communities. He studied how children who spoke Turkic languages at home adapted to learning Russian, and how their cognitive development was shaped by multilingual environments. He worked closely with teachers and institutions in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and other republics, contributing to the deeper understanding of how culture, language, and social context influence how children learn. His work demonstrated that language is never neutral. It always carries cultural meaning, identity, and influence. The zone of proximal development, ZPD, is often called the learning sweet spot. It represents the optimal space for learning, not too easy, not too hard. It's the space where students are challenged just enough to grow, but not so much that they become frustrated or shut down. More specifically, CPD is the space between what's known and what's unknown. It's the gap between what a student can already do on their own and what they can do with help. That's where the magic of meaningful learning happens. Tasks that may seem too difficult alone become possible with guidance. In the ZPD, a student might not be able to complete the task independently, but with a little support, encouragement, or modeling, they are fully capable. This is where real development occurs. That guidance often comes from teachers, parents, or even peers. Vygotsky called these people more knowledgeable others, or MKOs. These are individuals who have already mastered the skill and can help scaffold the learner's progress. They are essential to navigating the ZPD effectively. Something important is that the zone shifts as learning progresses. The ZPD isn't fixed. As students develop skills and confidence, what once required help becomes something they can do independently. New challenges enter the zone, and the cycle begins again. Learning is an ongoing, expanding process. Vygotsky believed that learning is not just social, it's culturally mediated. He believed that all higher mental functions like reasoning, memory, and problem solving are first learned through interaction with others and then internalized by the individual. But these interactions don't happen in isolation. They are shaped by cultural values, tools, and practices. So when a child learns from an MKO, they're not just learning a task, they're learning it through the lens of that person's culture. The way knowledge is passed on is influenced by language, tradition, worldview, and experience. This makes MKOs cultural guides. Whether it's a parent teaching a child how to farm, a grandparent passing on oral stories, or a teacher modeling a math strategy in a formal classroom, the MKO serves as a bridge between the learner and the culture. For example, a child growing up in a Turkic nomadic family might learn spatial navigation, herd management, and storytelling through active observation and guided participation with elders. Meanwhile, a child in an urban school may learn scientific reasoning and categorization from a teacher using structured academic language. Both children are learning, both are growing, but their methods, tools, and values reflect their cultural context. And that's the heart of Vygotsky's view. Learning is deeply social, but it's also culturally embedded. As educators, understanding this helps us create classrooms that respect diversity and honor the cultural knowledge our students bring with them. Scaffolding is one of the most practical and powerful tools an educator can use to support student learning. Scaffolding is temporary support for learning. It refers to guidance we offer students as they tackle new concepts or skills, just enough to help them make progress without becoming overwhelmed. It's like building a ladder. The support is there to help them climb higher than they could on their own. But this support isn't random. It must be tailored to the student's zone of proximal development. That's the sweet spot for learning, the space between what a student can already do independently and what they can do with help. Scaffolding is most effective when it targets tasks within this zone, providing the exact level of challenge and support the learner needs. This support can come from anyone more knowledgeable. It might be a teacher, a parent, a tutor, or even a peer. What matters is that the person understands the skill or concept well enough to guide the learner through it. These more knowledgeable others, or MKOs, are critical in making scaffolding work. What is key is that scaffolding is gradually reduced over time. As the learner becomes more confident and skilled, the MKO begins to step back. The goal isn't to keep holding their hand, it's to empower them to take over the task on their own. This process encourages independence. With each step, the student relies less on support and more on their own abilities. They move from guided participation to autonomous mastery. Scaffolding builds confidence, skill, and deeper understanding. As students succeed with support, they begin to trust themselves. They gain not only knowledge, but a sense of competence. And because they're actively engaged, solving problems, making decisions, and reflecting, they internalize the learning in a way that sticks. Scaffolding isn't just a teaching technique, it's a bridge, one that connects what students know to what they're ready to learn next. Imagine a Turkic nomad, perhaps a grandmother or great aunt, teaching a young girl from her extended family how to weave a carpet. This task is not just a craft, it is an inheritance of identity, symbolism, and cultural continuity. At first, the elder demonstrates everything: how to set the loom, how to stretch and wrap the threads evenly, how to mix and prepare the dyed wool, and how to read the patterns. The child watches and imitates. The elder may guide her hands directly, correct mistakes gently, and explain the meanings of the motifs. For example, protection, fertility, tribal symbols. At this stage, the child couldn't do it alone, but through rich, guided participation, she entered her zone of proximal development. As the child becomes more comfortable, the elder steps back slightly. While weaving simple geometric borders while the elder does the central pattern, she may be asked to guess the next color or knot technique, or narrate the steps out loud to reinforce memory and focus. Eventually, the girl weaves on her own, while the elder may sit nearby offering only occasional advice or praise. At this stage, the scaffolding has been removed, and the once learner becomes a practitioner, even capable of teaching others in the future. A Turkic nomad elder teaching her kinswoman to weave is more than instruction. It's culturally grounded scaffolding, infused with memory, identity, and meaning. It embodies Vygotsky's theory in a traditional, non-Western context, showing how learning is both social and cultural. While Vygotsky's social cultural theory has been incredibly influential in the field of education, it's important to also acknowledge its limitations and critiques. One major critique is that Vygotsky's theory lacks clear developmental stages. Unlike Piaget, who outlined a detailed sequence of cognitive stages tied to age, Vygotsky did not offer a step-by-step developmental framework. For some educators, this makes the theory harder to apply consistently across different age groups. Another concern is that the theory may overemphasize social interaction. Vygotsky placed a strong focus on learning through collaboration and cultural tools, but some argue that he gave too little attention to a child's own internal drive to learn or the ability to explore and discover independently. This leads to a related point. The theory tends to underplay individual learning. While learning with others is undoubtedly important, Vygotsky didn't fully address how children learn on their own through curiosity, experimentation, or personal reflection, which is a significant part of how many students grow. There's also ambiguity around scaffolding. Although the concept of scaffolding is widely used and incredibly helpful, Vygotsky himself never clearly defined how it should work in practice. This has resulted in a variety of interpretations, some of which may lack consistency or clarity in classroom use. Another limitation is the lack of empirical data from Vygotsky himself. Much of the research supporting his theory came after his death through the work of others. Vygotsky didn't leave behind a large body of experimental data, which has led some to question the scientific rigor of his original ideas. Some scholars also argue the theory is culturally biased toward collectivism. Since Vygotsky developed his ideas in the Soviet Union, a society that emphasized collective work and group learning, his theory may not translate as smoothly to more individualistic cultures, like the United States, where personal autonomy is sometimes a key educational goal. Finally, the theory was unfinished at the time of Vygotsky's death. He passed away at the young age of 37, which meant many of his concepts were still in development. As a result, some of his work remains open to interpretation, adaptation, or even contradiction by later theorists. I agree with Vygotsky's socio-cultural theory because I've seen it reflected both in my cultural heritage and in my own parenting and teaching experience. Coming from a Turkic background with family roots in Tatarstan and Kazakhstan, I was raised within a collective culture where elders still play a central role as cultural guides. Knowledge, values, and practical skills are passed down through interaction, storytelling, and modeling, exactly what Vygotsky described as learning mediated by more knowledgeable others. His theory resonates deeply with how learning traditionally occurs in my community, not through isolated study, but through language, mentorship, and cultural transmission. I also applied Vygotsky's principles while homeschooling my children, especially my son, who is dyslexic and dysgraphic. By using scaffolding, I was able to support his learning by breaking down complex tasks, giving hands-on guidance, and gradually reducing that support as his confidence and skills grew. I watched him learn to read and refine his fine and gross motor coordination, which contributed to improving his writing by teaching him our cultural arts and skills. We did things like weaving, whittling, and archery, just as Vygotsky envisioned in the zone of proximal development. My experience is that learning is not only individual, it is deeply social and cultural, which lends credibility to Vygotsky's theory in my eyes. While I deeply appreciate and identify with many aspects of Vygotsky's socio-cultural theory, I also believe it's essential for educators, especially in vastly diverse countries like the United States, to recognize the limitations of relying on a single educational framework. Vygotsky developed his theory in Soviet Russia, a state that was certainly multi-ethnic and multilingual, yet grounded in a collective political ideology that shaped educational goals and practices. His emphasis on learning through social interaction and cultural mediation reflects the values of many collective societies in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where my own Tatar and Kazakh heritage is rooted. However, the United States represents a more complex and varied cultural landscape. In this country, classrooms are filled with students from both collectivistic and individualistic backgrounds, and many whose experiences fall somewhere in between. What motivates and empowers one student may seem unfamiliar or even uncomfortable to another. Therefore, as educators, we must be cautious not to apply Vygotsky's ideas too narrowly or assume that all students benefit equally from highly social or collaborative learning methods. Instead, I believe it is our responsibility to blend theories, adapt methods, and most importantly, honor the cultural identities our students bring with them. We must create learning environments where both individual autonomy and group connection are valued. In a society as diverse as the US, and in a world that is becoming increasingly interconnected, our classrooms must foster not only academic growth, but also empathy, coexistence, and cross cultural respect. As an educator, I feel strongly that it is not our role to erase or overwrite a student's culture, but rather to acknowledge, respect, and learn from it. Every student's cultural background shapes how they think, communicate, and engages with learning. When we recognize and validate that diversity, we not only help our students thrive academically, we prepare them to contribute meaningfully to a global society that depends on tolerance, flexibility, and mutual respect. Vygotsky's social cultural theory is relevant to me as an educator because it aligns with both my personal experiences and my educational philosophy. As someone from a Turkic background, where collective values, family involvement, and elder guidance are central to learning, I've witnessed firsthand how culture and social interaction shape development. This theory reminds me that students do not enter the classroom as blank slates. They bring with them rich cultural histories, languages, and ways of thinking that should be acknowledged and built upon. As a history teacher, I see this theory as a powerful framework for designing meaningful and inclusive instruction. History isn't just a series of dates, it's a human story that students must actively engage with and interpret. By using scaffolding, I can help students analyze complex events, understand diverse perspectives, and think critically about cause and consequence. Through discussion, source analysis, collaborative projects, and culturally responsive teaching, I can guide students, gradually helping them take ownership of historical thinking. Vygotsky reminds me that students do not learn in isolation. Their thinking is shaped by culture, language, and relationships. As a history teacher, I want to create a learning environment where students not only absorb knowledge, but also learn to question, reflect, and grow together. Please take a few moments to review the references for this presentation.